Let's testify tonight.
Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord, but you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. Tell the world of the hope I have found. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Has He done it for anyone else? I said, has He done it for anyone else? Because the God that I serve, He's always at work. Has He done it for anyone else? So come on and testify of the power of God. Come on and tell the world of the hope we have found. For our body was broken, our hearts were made whole, and that's too good to keep to yourself. Come on and testify of the power of God. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify your voice. This is my. So I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify. Come on, take it out. Jesus, my champion, the victor of grace, the only one worthy of all of my praise. Yeah. So come on and testify. Oh, somebody lift Him high. Come on, testify of the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. Oh, for my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Sing that. Oh, my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, let's do that right now, Murfreesboro.
Good morning, everybody. Let me turn the air conditioning off so it's not too loud. Hope you are all doing well. And let me see here, because the timer's not started. So let me go to the layers and go to the countdown timer, settings, and start. There. Is it going to start? There we go. All right, so today, to start out before, and good to see you, Father Stomp. Before answering any of your questions or anything, I want to kind of go back to something that was brought up by Ebony last week, my daughter. And that is the idea that turning the other cheek, as stated by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, is not so much an act of being passive as much as an act of direct defiance by forcing Romans to slap you with the front of their hand rather than the back of their hand, because slapping with the back of their hand is considered for slaves, and while slapping with the front of the hand was for equals. And so that by turning the other cheek, you were forcing them to use the other side of their hand, and therefore making the Roman see you as an equal as opposed to a subordinate. And it's kind of interesting as I went down the rabbit hole on this a little bit to try and ascertain the truth of all this. And I could find a plethora of articles trying, basically saying almost word for word what Ebony said. Now, what Ebony said she saw on a popular YouTube channel called The Bible Project, which overall I really do like The Bible Project. And when I looked at the video that she sent from about that the Bible Project did, then yes, word for word, almost the exact same thing. And I found article after article that said almost the exact same thing, word for word. And I found that interesting because generally speaking, if you have a whole bunch of people describing something the same way, it means that there's usually a singular source of all this. And it was kind of difficult to find. It seems that the idea was popularized in 2008 in a feature film that I personally have not seen, but at least from what I could see, there was, where is it? Now I don't have it in front of me where I was looking at it earlier. Um, but yeah, there was a, oh wait, go up here. Yeah, 2008 movie Heart of Fire that took place during the Eritrean Civil War. And there was a scene where this happens. And I have not seen the movie. I don't know anything about it. So I'm just assuming that the poster of that particular comment was telling the truth. And that started a little discussion. But that seems to be based on an excerpt from a 1992 book. And so the book was written by a historian, Walter Wink. And in Walter Wink's book, or I'm sorry, he's not a historian, he's a theologian. But in Walter Wink's book, he basically brings up this whole thing about how being slapped on the front of your hand is different than being on the back of the hand, the symbolic meaning of all that and everything. However, there's no, at least not that I could find, there's no deep historical references to this outside of Wink's book from 1992. But it does seem to have become a fairly popular belief as far as among, because I found articles from several different churches that cite this explanation of the turn the other cheek. And so I really, I thought that, wow, maybe there's some truth to this. However, this is where I tend to stand on things. When in doubt and wherever possible, let the Bible define the terms of the Bible. As opposed to trying, and now granted, if there's good historical context to be used, then by all means we need to use it. But as far as finding, and maybe if you guys have access to something or know about something that I don't, if you can find some ancient writings that refer to this whole Roman tradition as far as slapping, I would love to hear it. But I haven't been able to find anything contemporaries of the first century to corroborate this. That being said, I want to look over the passage one more time, and then I'll get to the chat. So let's see. Let me switch screens here. Sorry. I'm a little tired this morning. All right. And so this is the passage we talked about last week. This is from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you've heard it said, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, take over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, I do want to, what I did find one theologian that I thought made an interesting argument based on this passage. And that is that if you go back to Genesis and the incident with Noah and his sons, that public nudity is not just a shame on the person who is nude in public, but is a shame for the person who witnesses the public nudity, as in Noah's sons. And so the argument that he was making is that this is, they're extrapolating that basically if someone demands your shirt and you give them your coat as well, so you're standing there naked, you are putting shame on that person by witnessing your nakedness. Another way to look at it would be, and the same with the going the extra mile thing. But another way to kind of look at it in more contemporary means for us nerds is to think about the Deep Space Nine episode House of Quark, when Quark was challenged to a duel, and he basically, he obviously was completely outclassed by a Klingon warrior, so he simply threw his weapon aside and offered no resistance, to which brought shame upon the Klingon warrior that was going to kill him anyway, because, obviously Quark was a wimpy little Ferengi, and there's no honor in killing a wimpy little unarmed Ferengi. So I found that interesting, but I also think that, again, if we can, is there a way for the Bible to bring a little more clarity in this, as far as the meaning of all this? And I think there is, because Jesus didn't just give one sermon in his career. The Sermon on the Mount is his most famous. But the Sermon on the Plains, which is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, is also he goes over this part of the message, but with a slightly different flair to it. So I wanted to bring that up too. And in the Sermon on the Plains, he says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those that curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you." Now, if we look at that passage, and we really want to break that down. And yes, Arabic, it's in Luke chapter 6, I believe. If we really break that one down, notice what he's saying. He starts out saying, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So that right there sets up the whole context of this. He is talking about showing genuine love for your enemies and to do good things for people who literally hate you, right? Then the next thing he says is, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them to the other cheek also. And if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt, etc. And so these are examples not of being defiant, not of raising your own dignity to their level, but to do good to those who just mistreated you. And so it would seem kind of strange that if Jesus meant that if someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other cheek was an act of defiance, why that wouldn't fit in this passage? In that, and do unto others as you would have them to do to you. Obviously, the golden rule is mentioned several times throughout Scripture, but you know, if you take that to heart, honestly, if you try to reverse the scenario, if you are do something to humiliate someone, would you want them to stand up to you and humiliate you, or would you want them to be passive? I think that this is showing ultimate passivity and not resisting evil. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that there is never a time but it's simply, and I think that a lot of people misunderstand this about what Jesus was talking about. But looking over the entirety of Jesus's messages, it would seem that Jesus was very anti self defense. Because, and as he likes to put it, you have nothing to fear from those who can do no more than take your life. Rather, you should only fear he who can, destroy your soul, and so, which would be obviously God. Um, and so, as far as self defense, he's saying there's no need because you know the, they can't really do anything to you in an eternal sense. However, there's also Jesus talks about defending others. Whether you're defending the honor of God with the temple incident or you're defending the honor of your brethren, whatever it may be, there is no greater love than the person who is willing to lay down their life for their brother. And so if that's the case, then it would seem that defense of others is perfectly acceptable, but self defense is considered an act of selfishness. And so that's how I take it. Now, I am not a total expert on it. I certainly don't have a degree in ancient cultures or anything like that. But when you look at the actual context of what Christ is saying, it seems to me like he is advocating for a form of total passivity, not a form of passive resistance. However, that's just my take on it. I'm perfectly, I don't think this is a major, as they say, major on the major, minor on the minors. If you disagree with me, that's perfectly okay. We can still both be Christians and disagree on this. But I think that turning the other cheek is not meant as an act of defiance or an act of posturing oneself as the equal of those who may have mistreated you, if that makes sense. All right, so that's it for me today. Other than that, we'll go to the old chat and see what you guys have to say here. Let me switch screens right back. All right. And so, go back to where were we? Okay. So, Stan Lee says, anyone have any advice on dealing with a flea infestation? I tried the medication on the little tubes, and sponge baths with dish detergent, but not sure it's working. The medication in little tubes, you're talking about the topical stuff, like I assume this is for like your like little dogs or something. That seemed to work for us, but our dogs have always been strictly indoor animals, so we've never had a major flea problem. We did have fleas. I'm trying to remember. I think it was on Auntie when we first got her, but the topical creams worked fine. Carlos says, hi, I hope everyone's as well as can be. You as well. Um, Speaking of using the front versus back of hand, I always laugh in movies when people need blood, so they cut the palm of their hand with a blade. That would actually be very painful and take a while to heal and inhibit your dexterity. Yeah, that I never, I liked better like if you, if I could be misremembering it, but I think, or like I'm trying to remember what it was. Yeah, I think it was Rob Roy, and where the person is going in for the killing stroke, and someone will literally grab the blade of the sword, and you'll even see the blood trickling down their hand as they're holding the sword, and it's like, you know what, no human being could do that. I'm sorry, that sword, I mean, all the person would have to do is pull the sword forward or back and just saw into their flesh. It would be horrifically painful, and ultimately useless, a way to try to stop a sword strike. So, although in that same movie, I did like at the beginning of the movie when Liam Neeson was confronted by the one guy who wanted to duel him, and so he said, "Okay, we'll fight till first cut," and then he slices I think it was the side of his hand on the guy's blade, and says, "Well, looks like you win." I thought that was a fun little scene. That was kind of the way that I think when Ebony was bringing that up last week, that's how some people see the turning the other cheek, is that you're basically humiliating the other person with your passivity. And I don't think that that was Christ's intention. Josiah says, where have you been? Well, man, this week was an interesting one. So I take full credit for not having been on since last Sunday. Um, Monday had something to do with the wife. Tuesday, um, I was just exhausted, and I fell out and didn't realize until it was too late. Um, and then Friday, again, just exhausted. And so I apologize, guys. This week I will try to do better. Um, Stanley says, should I shave my head? Oh, are you asking Stan where he's been about the fleas? Oh, it's the fleas on you as opposed to on your animals. That would suck. Um, but yeah, I don't even know how you do a fleas on a person. I just think about the dogs. Um, and maybe it was that a TikTok challenge. Okay. I've seen anything about. I have seen. I assume you mean you haven't seen anything about the Romans slapping each other. Yeah, I haven't found anything other that predates the 1992 book by Wink that mentions it. Figured they would have trouble doing the ice bucket one. Okay. Oh, you're talking the slapping as a TikTok challenge. Gotcha. Finally made it kind of on time. Well, I'm glad to have you here, Eric. Yeah, it was more of a, let's see, wasn't that more of a Saxon or maybe a French thing to demand a duel? Yeah, I don't know enough about, like, as far as Roman culture is concerned. I mean, I know they were very duty and honor bound, but I don't remember anything about, yeah, slapping someone as a form of insult necessarily. Um, but, I'm not saying that, it wasn't a part of their culture. I just don't know of anything specifically. And and even more specifically, whether hitting someone with the back of your hand or the front of your hand actually makes a significant difference in Roman culture. Guess they would have gotten the ideas from the Romans. Oh, the French, yes. Um, I mean, I haven't seen anything about Romans slapping each other. Yeah, I figured that much. Sermon on the Plains. Yes, there was a Sermon on the Plains. I believe that's what it's called. But yeah, it says the reason it's called that is it says this is the same chapter but 10 verses earlier. It says he went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem and from the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and those who tried to touch him because his power was coming from him and healing them all. And then it goes on to him starting the actual sermon that I read a section of. Was the fish and bread during the Sermon on the Mount? I think maybe that was from an earlier sermon. There was the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the, what was it? I can't remember, it was 4,000 or what, 4,000 or something like that. There were two big feedings, and I believe that one of them was after the Sermon on the Mount, if I remember correctly. Let me see. So, looking at, bear with me a second. Uh, so, giving to the needy, prayer, fasting, treasures in heaven, do not worry. I'm just skimming through the Sermon on the Mount. Judging, ask, seek, knock, the narrow, wide gates, true and the false prophets, true and false disciples, wide and foolish. Let's see. No, I guess after the Sermon on the Mount, he just went into healing people and then the faith of the centurion. So I guess that was not it. So then if we look at the other sermon, the Sermon on the Plains, let's see, don't judge, tree and its fruit. Moving on. And then, yeah, no, it doesn't look like it was directly related to either of those. A sermon on a flat bit of open land. Yes. Very good. I never thought about Israel having plains. Yeah. Well, just said a level place. So, yeah. Nothing bad happened to you. Nothing bad has happened to you, right? Are you talking to me, Josiah? Because is that a joke? Fish and bread were two occasions near the sea. Yeah. Blessed are the meek. That's nice, isn't it? I'm glad they're getting something because they have a heck of a time. Yeah. And that's another thing is that why would he bless the meek and stuff if although it's also interesting because he blesses the meek separate from the peacemakers, which some people interpret as being like law enforcement, but I don't know that that's necessarily an accurate representation, but it's a nice sentiment. All right, trying to remember from The Chosen, he did a few of those extended multi-day long sermons. Yes. Well, I do think that if I remember correctly, the feeding was because he had a large crowd around him, but I don't remember if the crowd was there for one of his big sermons or just because he was healing people. We could look it up real quick. Let's see what the context is. Sorry, little girl, I had to move. Let me try to adjust my chair a little bit without freaking you out too bad. All right. All right, let me look up. All right, feeding the 5,000. That was in Matthew chapter 14. So, yeah, that happens somewhat later than the Sermon on the Mount. Let's see. Let's see. Jesus, Jonah. Sure that was. Let me look at that. Yeah, 14, 13. No, okay, I must be. Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. I'm like, this doesn't make sense because I wasn't in the right chapter. Okay. Yeah, it says that. So so John the Baptist was killed, and then it says when Jesus heard about that's happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "There's a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they get to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." So it was basically Jesus withdrew to collect his thoughts over the death of his cousin, and the crowds followed him. So Jesus, being the nice guy that he is, went ahead and healed the sick and all that. And then it was getting late, so then he did the feeding of the 5,000. So, and let's see, feeding of the 4,000 was in the Matthew 15. So we just a chapter later. All right. Okay, so after he healed a Canaanite woman, then it says Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up to the mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, and the lame walking. Jesus called his disciples and said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat." So then we go on and he feeds them. So in both cases, these were times where Jesus was healing people as opposed to preaching. All right. Eagle person whose name I cannot pronounce. I don't know if Jesus wants total passivity. Back in Rome, maybe he was advocating for it for good of the offended, but it's never a good idea to anger someone who has a weapon on you. Well, what Jesus obviously advocated for was, yeah, and I think it's better iterated in some of the writings of Paul that come later, that whenever possible, you were to live at peace. And so, and again, that you should only come to violence in the defense of others, not in the defense of one's self. So it wouldn't be total passivity in that you wouldn't sit by and allow others to be harmed. However, it is passivity in regards to self defense. Josiah says, "I have a problem with being meek." Well, most of us do. Um, Meekness occasionally happens in Trek, where one of the protagonists decides, for nobility reasons, not to exert force against someone else. But that's usually seen like, unfortunately, in Trek, frequently it's something. And don't get me wrong, you guys know I love Star Trek, but like, for example, Captain Kirk beats up the bad guy and then has the opportunity to finish him off, and then says, "No, I'm not going to kill him." Right? You look at the fight with the Gorn. You look at his fight with Commander Krug from Star Trek Three. It happens over and over where the good guy wins, but then rather than finishing off the villain, shows mercy. And I think there's a difference between meekness and mercy. And if you were being meek, you wouldn't fight at all. And in fact, if you want to see a meek character from Star Trek, I would say Surak from the original series. He was truly meek. He was completely nonviolent to the point of allowing himself to be killed, rather than commit an act of violence. And I think, unfortunately, that is closer. Unfortunately, meaning that as opposed to what as humans we would naturally want, that's closer to what Christ calls us to be. Is to there is no righteousness in instigating violence. Yeah, I didn't miss any live streams. It was a holiday here on Monday, and I didn't see anything on Friday. Yeah, I apologize, guys. Head shaving was a joke. Fleas are on the stupid cat. Oh, well, there's a simple solution there. Get rid of the cat. Cats are terrible. ABJ says, "Meekness often refers to the soldier who has a weapon and chooses not to be a bully." I don't know that like, if we look at, I always understood meekness not to necessarily mean having power. However, that's the best opportunity to be meek, I would suppose. Okay, so meekness is a character trait often misunderstood as weakness, but it biblically defined, according to this AI at least, as strength under control. It involves having power and strength, but choosing to be gentle, humble, and patient, using that power with restraint for the good of others. Um, and let's see. But you see, if you look at the dictionary definition of meek, the factor condition of being meek, submissiveness. So, and let's see. And we'll go to, in Merriam Webster, mild, moderate, humble, submissive quality. It seems, you know, because that's funny because that AI definition seems to be based on articles that kind of suggest that are, saying that turning the other cheek is an act of defiance. Narrow Mind, good to see you, says, why do you think Jesus seems to have expectations of theological knowledge from his contemporaries? If enough time had passed, would people have ever gotten the idea that hate would, let's see, if enough time had passed, would people have ever got the idea hate is the same as murder without Jesus coming to explain things? Um, So why do you think Jesus seems to have an expectation of theological knowledge from his contemporaries? It's simple. Jesus was a Jew living in Israel, and in Israel, understanding the basic theological concepts of the Torah was required for all Jewish males, and many Jewish women studied it. They just weren't sent to Hebrew school to do it. Um, so uh, basically, at least all the men that Jesus met in his journeys in Israel, and of course many outside of Israel as well, would have a pretty in-depth theological knowledge of Judaism. The only people that really didn't have an in-depth knowledge of Judaism were people like the Roman centurion or the Samaritans. Sorry, I always get the Sumerians and Samaritans confused. But the Samaritans still believed in God, but they had different. It would almost be like comparing a say a high church denomination of Christianity, like say the Roman Catholic Church, with a very low church form of Christianity, like say um, the you know Pentecostals or something, and so they're very different in the way that they worship, and the problem is that both see the others as blasphemers because they don't worship the same way. Um, and while Jesus did come first to Israel, he did show that his message was for everybody. As far as would people have figured out on their own that hate and murder are indeed the same thing in the eyes of God without Jesus? I would dare say no, because if you look at the actions of the Pharisees of the day, and in fact, even if you look at the writings of many rabbis to this day, remember, Judaism is a religion of law. And the interesting thing about that is that so a rabbi is almost akin to a lawyer, an expert in the law. Back in the day, those would have been the Pharisees, right? But in modern day, we don't really have the Pharisees and Sadducees running around, but we do have the rabbinic tradition. And where there is law and there are lawyers, there is, basically everything is a very strict letter of the law thing. So this is why, for example, in the sometimes infamous depiction of the woman caught in adultery. Some people tried to argue that, you see, this is just another example of sexism in the Bible, because how is it that the woman was caught in adultery and yet there was no man there being punished with her, right? And that's the one where Jesus stops the Pharisees from killing her and says, "Let he who was without sin cast the first stone." In that incident, again, looking at the law, adultery is defined as having sex with another person's spouse. So, if if for example, so you have a married couple, and the man has sex with a prostitute, which is what basically is taking place in this incident, or we see that actually in the Old Testament as well. Then the man, assuming the prostitute is not married, the man has not committed adultery, while the woman has, because the man is married. Well, guess what? By the letter of the law, that means that she is to be put to death, and nothing happens to him, because the Pharisees understood very, very well the letter of the law. They had it memorized, and absolutely, there was a requirement for them to memorize the entirety of the Torah, which is the books of the law in the Old Testament. So they understood the law inside and out. They understood every little detail of it, and that's why they would do horrific things, because they knew that they were technically legal. Because it would be one of those things. Well, like some people argue, hey, pedophilia is not directly listed in the Bible as being against the law. Therefore, it's okay, right? That's kind of I'm sure they didn't do this, but that's kind of the attitude that the Pharisees would have, is that if it's not expressly and explicitly forbidden by the law, then it was okay. Now, there's nothing in the law that specifically states that hating another person is a crime. And therefore, they would never get the idea that it's the same as murder. That's my 2 cents on it. Someone with a cat versus someone with a baseball bat. Well, the cat is not going to help anyone, so the baseball bat person clearly wins. What are some Chuck Norris stuff you watch? I'm not a big Chuck Norris fan. Honestly, the only Chuck Norris movie that I can think of off the top of my head, and I don't even remember the name of it, but it's the one where he fights Bruce Lee. High Rise in the house. Good to see. Nice to see some new people popping in every now and then. What is your view on the harrowing of hell? Do you believe it's an eternal event or something that only applied to those who died before Christ? Neither, actually. I am a subscriber of, and I don't like to. Let me first, since you obviously don't know me very well, let me say this: I call myself a non-sectarian follower of Christ, or Christian. And when I say that, I mean that I do not follow a set of doctrines. I try to follow what the Bible says directly, rather than follow a summary written by people who study the Bible. I prefer to just study the Bible, because doctrines can frequently be wrong. But in this particular case, there's a doctrine that comes very close to what I believe, although not exactly the same. And that doctrine is called annihilationism. And the idea is that hell, unfortunately, most of what we get about hell in the modern context comes from things like Dante's Inferno and Bugs Bunny, as opposed to from the Bible. While the Bible does use an imagery of fire, particularly in Revelation, that hell is a lake of fire, hell is also more than anything else, is referred to as death. Notice, like, if we go to everybody's favorite passage of the Bible, because it's like the only thing that everybody knows, is John 3:16, right? And John 3:16 starts, I had to bring it up because I don't want to ever misquote it. So it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." Well, think about that for just a second. Everybody knows that passage. And that passage is considered one of the key passages of what the gospel is all about. But they're missing that that's telling you right there. If you believe in Jesus, and that doesn't mean like you believe he existed, it means you believe in him, you trust him, and you accept his gifts. If you truly believe in him, you shall not perish. Now, does that mean that everybody who's a Christian should never die? And that means there are no real Christians except maybe Enoch, because he's the only person other than, well, actually, he's the only person who straight up didn't die. Or is there one other, I think? But anyway, but Enoch, was taken away without dying. No, what it means is that you shall not face what the Revelation even calls the second death, which is being cast into the lake of fire. And so it is my humble opinion that, with the exception of people specifically listed in Revelation, and I believe it's those that literally take arms against God, that the only punishment that we commonly refer to as hell is in fact execution on a permanent level. That you, after the resurrection, you are judged, and if you are condemned, you are ultimately utterly destroyed. And Jesus even warns of this in a passage that I mentioned a little earlier, which is that do not fear those that can only kill you, meaning other people. Instead, you should only fear he who can destroy your soul in hell. Well, if your soul is destroyed, it's not continuing on. And there's also, I think, a common misconception. In fact, I heard Pastor Mike from our church mention this yesterday, and it is a very common misconception, which is that humans are innately immortal. And so, and like, I think the way that Mike put it is that you're destined to an eternity with God or an eternity separated from God. That's the common, softer way of saying hell these days that people tend to use. And the problem with that is that doesn't, at least to me, and don't get me wrong, I'm certainly, Mike is a great pastor, and I wouldn't pick a fight with him over this or anything, but I just kind of disagree with him. Humans, I do not believe, are innately immortal, because if you look at Genesis, there were two trees in the garden that were very important. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And had Adam and Eve been allowed to consume from the tree of life, they never would have died. However, because they disobeyed God and they chose to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they were expelled from the garden, and they could no longer consume from the tree of life. And that may explain why Adam, like Adam and the first several generations after him had such ridiculously long lifespans, because he did eat from the tree of life, but he didn't get to continue eating from the tree of life. And so that could explain why he lived 900 and whatever years. I know a lot of people like to argue about that stuff, but just looking at it on its surface. But it also clearly states that in paradise, that is, if after the resurrection and your judgment, if you are not condemned, you get to go to paradise. And paradise is not like living on a cloud strumming a harp. It's earth, just like this one, except without the curse that was brought about from the fall. And there's a new city that's described, a new Jerusalem where people will live. And in that city are groves that include the tree of life for anybody to eat, which it means that man will be immortal in paradise because they will have access to the tree of which we are denied on earth. So no, I do not. But obviously, if there is no presence of God in, like, let's just say, take the most contemporary Christian take on hell, which is that it's just an existence completely separate from God. And so all good things are missing. Well, a good thing would include the tree of life. And if you can't get to the tree of life, and the natural state of man is to decay and die, then your existence would not be a permanent one. So thank you for the question, High Rise, and I hope I answered you. Depends on how angry the cat is. Now, cats never help. When they get upset, they have five ends that are pointy. Five ends that are pointy? Oh, you mean like teeth and four paws? They do, but they're not going to do it to defend you. They're going to do it to defend themselves. I see the cat versus bat. I'm calling the police about domestic violence. There you go. Looks like anyone interesting. Looks like season 2, The House of David show is already out on episode 4. I honestly couldn't get through season 1, so I probably watch it on the fast this year, but I did not care for it that much. They misused the meekness with the Vulcans in Discovery. Well, yeah, that's kind of the funny thing because the Vulcans in Discovery were complete warmongers, where the Vulcans from the original series are, for the most part, pacifists. Spock was the exceptionally violent Vulcan. I'm surprised they must have filmed them concurrently. Stream season 2 almost never seemed to come out that fast. Yeah, that is kind of surprising. Fireman with an axe versus random thug with board. Really? I mean, one guy's got a sharp weapon that's designed to split wood, and the other guy's got a piece of wood. I don't think there's much of a fight there. Season 1 started late February 2025, and season 2 just started beginning of October. Yeah, that does seem really fast. They must have filmed them concurrently. But also, it could be that they're just desperate to get it out because season 1 didn't do so well. The thug because fireman wouldn't attack anyone with the axe. Well, okay. Do you have to be capable of overpowering the other person to be considered meek? By that definition, I would say yes. Does it have to be a choice, or are you meek if you're just a little wimp who has no choice? I think that being meek, at least the way I look at it, is a person who does not offer self-defense, which is a very difficult thing to do. Even if you're, the 5'2", 80-pound weakling, if somebody's coming after you, generally speaking, you're going to try to defend yourself. Or even like meekness would be, you don't run away either. Because it says you don't resist evil at all. Let's see. Someone with a blunderbuss versus someone with a revolver, 8 feet apart. Well, a blunderbuss is basically a very early version of a shotgun. But 8 feet apart, a blunderbuss is not nearly as powerful as a modern revolver as far as accuracy and just penetration ability. That being said, if they fire simultaneously and neither of them are wearing armor, the person with the blunderbuss has a better chance of survival taking one bullet from 8 feet. And Narrow one with a $10 super chat. Thank you so much, my friend. Says, thank you, sir. Subbed for years, but never stopped in for theology. Okay. Or Narrow Mind, I mean. Yeah, this channel I've kind of retuned towards theological stuff. I'm hoping that, some people might enjoy it, but, it's a smaller crowd, but I'm okay with that. He studies the Bible like a Star Trek script, or maybe it's vice versa. I think, yeah, you know what? The funny thing is, I have, we really should, if assuming that you believe in God, particularly in the God of the Bible, as far as that you think the Bible is a true and accurate historical text or group of historical texts, at least the books of the Bible that are historical in nature. Let's keep in mind, the Bible isn't one type of literature. There's historical books, there's commentaries, there's prophetic books, there's legal books, and there's books of what they call wisdom, which are more or less books of poetry. And so one of the fundamental necessities to properly understanding the Bible is to know what type of literature you're reading and to know that it's not just one. You know, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking the Bible is a book, but the Bible, the Protestant Bible in particular, is a collection of 66 books. And those 66 books are not in dispute by any church group. Like the Catholics, the Orthodox, uh, don't exclude any of the 66 books, but they may include stuff that wasn't part of that 66. So, like, the Catholics have the Apocrypha, the Ethiopian Orthodox have one additional book, I can't remember what it's called, that's unique to them. But the 66 canonized books of the typical Bible are not in dispute. And so, if we are believers that the Bible is a collection of genuine texts about God, then we should be studying them the way that we study Star Trek scripts. We should care very much about the deeper meaning of things. And we should be looking at, like when people say, aha, there's a contradiction here or a contradiction there, we should be examining those things and saying, okay, is this a genuine problem, or is this something that people are making a mountain out of a molehill about? Because differences are to be expected. Keep in mind, and this is one of those things that a lot of people have a difficult time wrapping their heads around. Biblical inspiration, or the divine inspiration of the Bible, means that God inspired various people from Moses to Paul and everybody in between to actually, I think the last book of the Bible to be written was probably by John when we look at Revelation. But so from Moses to John and everything in between, we look at these people were inspired by God. They were inspired by the Holy Spirit to write down various historical events, legal things, and books of wisdom, etc. And so they did. However, that doesn't mean that God dictated word for word what they say. And this is one of those things where people get a little squeamish talking about. We know that, Timothy, I think, says, all scripture is God breathed, meaning that it came from God. But that doesn't mean that people don't put their own little flair into it, Paul is a great example. He throws a lot of his own opinion into it, but he usually will support that opinion with, and say why he believes this is true. However, if you have two people testifying about the same event, and one person, like, let's say, like, I can't remember what it was, but something from the Old Testament that people like to make a fuss about is that the size of the army in a particular battle. And I don't know, because I haven't really gone into this particular discrepancy in detail to really examine it. But they say, oh, in one passage it says the army was, say, 100,000 men, and in another passage it might say it was 200,000 men, just throwing random numbers out there. And you say, aha, contradiction. Therefore, the Bible is invalid. Well, is that a contradiction, or is it just a, is the point of that passage just to say there's a lot of people there? Is it really important that it be exactly 100,000 or exactly 200,000? And I'm not answering that here because I haven't studied that particular thing, but I'm saying that's something worth examining. A great classic example that people say is, what were the last words that Jesus said on the cross? Because in one gospel, it says that the last thing he said was, "It is finished." In one gospel, it says that the last thing he said is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in one gospel, it says that he let out a loud wail and then just died, right? And so it says, so, aha, contradiction. However, it is entirely possible that all three of those are true, because what if you were at the actual crucifixion, Jesus looked around and said, "It's finished." And then he looked up at the sky and said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then he screamed and then he died, right? And all the different authors just latched onto different pieces of it. They also have different sources in some case. Like, for example, Luke is probably the most historical of the Gospels. All the Gospels are historical texts, but Luke is an actual. I mean, well, he was a doctor, but he was also a historian. Luke actually went around and was interviewing people and then basically wrote his gospel based on the collection of all the information. While Mark is the direct dictation of Peter, right? Matthew was written by Matthew, and John was written by John. And so they were all done in differing perspectives. And so you would expect if Luke's going around getting testimony from various people, and one person says, "Oh, yeah, I remember the last thing he did was yell, my God, why did, you know?" And so he puts that down in the book. But then someone else happens to remember that, "Oh, no, the last thing he did was yell." And so they put that in their book, right? So that's not really a contradiction. A contradiction would be something like if Jesus was saying, "Hey, if someone slaps you in the cheek, turn the other cheek." And then in another passage, Jesus says, "So if someone slaps you in the cheek, punch them in the face." That would be a contradiction. And then there are times when people try to mix up whether or not something is literal versus metaphor. And it can be difficult to tell depending on how you're reading it. So, yeah. So it is worth studying. And you need to look for that stuff, just like we look at Star Trek. Now, granted, with Star Trek, it's different because it's a work of fiction, and so we kind of invent ways to make continuity work. But with the Bible, we should seriously examine it and say, is there, because it's not so much a matter of can we come up like, that Jesus had a tricorder in his pocket and that's how he managed to do. No, we need to look at it and say, is there a plausible explanation for this? Because if the answer is no, we have a problem. If the answer is yes, then we move on. Because if there's a plausible explanation we can think of, then it's entirely reasonable to assume that either that's true or some other plausible explanation is true. Let's see. But yeah, general open mic theology every Sunday morning and detailed Bible reading on Monday and Tuesday evenings. That is correct. I arrived at church, stayed everyone. All right, you have a good one. Of course, that was 15 minutes ago, so she didn't hear me. We're all partway through Leviticus now. We already did all of Genesis and Exodus. Yeah, Leviticus has been interesting. I really am sorry that we didn't get into it this week because, we're getting into everybody's favorite part, sexual morality. Fred Flintstone versus Captain Caveman. Oh, that's clearly going to be Captain Caveman. Captain Caveman has an assortment of weapons hiding under his shaggy fur, where Fred really doesn't have much. I mean, Fred is strong, clearly, but I don't think that he has the weaponry and combat skills of Captain Caveman. And didn't Captain Caveman appear in the Flintstones at some point? I don't remember. Robert says, Sidetrack, good morning today and shalom, 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 Robert. Good to see you. I'll be sure to return. Well, good. You will always be welcome, never mind. Maybe we can get you to change that name to Open Mind. Ooh. Sidetrack, the tree of life was the Son of God. Respectfully, I would say, where did you get that from? Because I don't think that anywhere Jesus said, okay, so here, I'm going to drop fruit on the ground, you're going to eat it and become. I mean, he does kind of say that he offers the bread of life, but I don't think that he meant that he is the tree of life. Because if you look at the description of paradise, it seems quite literal that there are trees like the tree of life that you can consume from in paradise. Further, I don't think that in the garden, Jesus was standing there in the garden pretending to be a tree. So I think that Jesus used his spiritual teachings as a metaphor for the bread of life, but I don't think that he was being literal there. But that's just my opinion. How come no nerd fights out there? I was exhausted. I have no excuses. Vulcans are powerful but choose to turn the other cheek. Yes, Vulcans are quite meek. Um, or at least act that way in the beginning. Well, yeah, until we get to Discovery Era Vulcans. They're like pool sharks. They lure you in with their false kindness and they turn on you. Well, Vulcans, the difference between Vulcans and Christian meekness is Vulcans are dicks. Let's see. Those sound like Romulans. Well, some books are supposed to be direct transcripts of Jesus's words written by eyewitnesses, while others seem to be hearsay. Well, okay, so if you look at the four Gospels, right? Again, Mark is the dictations of Peter to Mark. And so Peter was an eyewitness to most of the stuff. I mean, he was the first true leader of the church after Jesus left. And then if you Luke is really the one that I guess you would say would be hearsay in that Luke gathered evidence. Luke was not an eyewitness, and he went around and interviewed eyewitnesses and put their stories together into the Gospel of Luke. But John was written by an eyewitness, John, and Matthew was written by an eyewitness, Matthew. Sexual morality. I like skin disease. But Fred Flintstone could probably do some damage with a bowling ball. That's true. Fred had a bowling ball with him. He could probably hurt Captain Caveman. I'll give you that. Samurai Jack, Mr. Know-It-All, and Young Michael versus the Guardian from Samurai. The goal is that Michael and Mr. Know-It-All have to run to the portal. Oh, that's easy. Well, not so easy. I mean, Mr. Know-It-All would probably make it. I probably wouldn't, because running is not something that I can really do anymore. No, Jesus wasn't an actual cheese. It's just another way he was referred to as. I don't remember. Well, that's the thing. I remember him calling himself the bread of life, or the he says things like this when you drink this water you will thirst again, but when you drink the water that I have you will never thirst again, and stuff like that in metaphor. But I don't remember him calling himself the tree of life. I mean, he says I am the truth, the life, and the way, but that's not quite the same thing. So I mean, like Robert, I'm not calling you a liar. Don't get me wrong. I respect your, even where we have our differences. I respect your beliefs, but I would just want to know: is there a specific passage that you think fills us in that the tree of life, as referred to in Paradise or in Genesis, is actually a reference to Jesus as opposed to an actual tree? Narrow Mind says, I actually chose the name based on Jesus himself saying the way is narrow. Well, then it should be narrow way, not narrow mind. Because I think that you should have an open mind. But I think that there is, and when I say open mind, it doesn't mean, oh, well, you have to be open to all the false teachings out there. But you have to be open to going where the evidence leads. And this is something that I think is a real problem in many atheistic circles, and that they say, oh, yeah, we just follow the evidence because there is no evidence. Ha ha ha. And that's patently false. If you actually do follow the evidence overwhelmingly points to God exists. And I'm sorry, spend an hour just talking about that. B, Christ was a real guy. C, many people in the ancient world genuinely believed that Christ died and resurrected, and were even willing to be tortured to death rather than say that they did not witness this. And so, is it a reliable source of information? I think that if you follow the evidence logically, that yes, it's more reliable than not. And then, of course, you have, and if you do believe that Christ was legit in that, he really was who he said he was, then you ought to do what you can to follow him. Um, but yeah. I guess many of the eyewitnesses simply weren't scribes and not capable of writing it on their own. Yeah, well, keep in mind, being a proficient writer was a very rare skill back then. Like, we take it for granted today because everybody goes to school and learns how to write. Obviously, every one of you can write at least somewhat because you're writing your responses in this very chat. However, back then, not everybody learned to read and write. And it was actually a fairly rare gift for women, and for men it was really those that did well in their early days of school and went on to study under a rabbi that really learned to proficiently read and write. And so that's one of the reasons that Paul wrote so much of the New Testament. He was a Pharisee, he was a well educated man. Luke was a well educated man. Notice Peter did not write his own gospel. He got Mark to write it for him. Mark was likely a scribe. And the reason being, Peter was a simple fisherman. Matthew, on the other hand, was a tax collector and probably fairly well educated by the Romans. So you see, and John was clearly educated at least enough because he wrote a couple of the most relevant books of the Bible. Like Jesus was the rock and gave water in the desert, it's a metaphor true. It's metaphorically true or something. Well, the thing is, like Jesus, well, you see, I don't think Jesus was the rock that gave water in the desert. There was a rock that gave water in the desert based on the miracle that God did. I don't think Jesus was that rock, right? I mean, Jesus could say he was the source of the water that came from the rock, but I don't think Jesus was literally that rock. And I think that we're getting too deep into metaphor when we start saying stuff like that, because when you get to a point where you just say, well, none of the Old Testament things were true, it was just parables about Jesus. Jack Sparrow versus Long John Silver. Oh, Jack Sparrow's, come on. Long John Silver slaughters him, assuming he doesn't have like the whatever doubloon that makes him basically immortal. Peter and John were fishermen, not much call for writing in that profession. Yeah, John probably learned to write later in life because the books of John were the last gospel written, and the book of Revelation was the last book of the Bible written. So John probably learned how to write later on. Robert says, I don't know any specific verses right now that refer to Jesus as the tree of life. I would have to watch the Shepherd's channel and see if they list the verses. If you do, I would love to hear it. And so if you think about it, Robert, and you come back with something, we'll absolutely talk about it. So, and again, not trying to be a jerk. I just want to hear where that's coming from because I'm more interested in the truth than being right. That's why I spent so much time looking into the whole turning the other cheek thing, because the way that my daughter put it last week, it was like, I don't know, that seems like odd, so let's do some research. And tried to do it as open-mindedly as I can. And I think that the more modern understanding of turn the other cheek being an act of defiance, I think is just wrong. I think that is a modern, unfortunately, it's a way of man trying to elevate himself in this situation rather than to be submissive and passive, which is more what Jesus calls us to do, and that's harder. But when the world hears the word open-minded, it tends towards liberalism, doesn't it? But I'll ask you, do you believe love is logical from the Bible's perspective? I'm not sure it is. Is love logical? Yes. In fact, more so than most people realize. Most people, they think of love as the warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you're near that special girl or whatever. That's not love. That's lust. That's eros. Now, don't get me wrong, and this is where people kind of get confused. They say, well, lust is a sin, isn't it? No, lust is a sin if it is outside of marriage, right? Or even if it has, we'll just say, improper intent. Like when a young couple is in love, which just means lusting after each other, more or less, and they're going to get married, there's nothing sinful about their lust for each other as long as they don't act upon it until they're actually married. So But if you are a married person and you see some chick and you're like, yeah, look at that now, you know, it's one thing if somebody walks by in front of you and they look hot and you just go, wow. It's another thing if you start turning your head and watching, right? That's the difference between sin and just a quick emotional reaction. However, when we talk about like biblical love, particularly when we're talking about things like marriage, what do you do? Spring got her foot stuck inside her sweater, so she can't really walk around right now. Yes, you're a silly girl. You always do this. Well, you're just going to be stuck for right now. But anyway, when we look at the kind of love between a husband and wife that we're called to be, and notice most marriages back then were not two young people fall in love and decide to get married. It's usually an arranged marriage by their parents. And the husband and wife are expected to love each other, even though they may not even know each other. Now, how is that possible? How do you love someone you didn't meet until the day you married, in some cases? And how is that even possible? Well, it's very simple. They're not talking about eros. They're not talking about that the minute you see them, you're necessarily going to feel that emotional drive to want to reproduce with that person, right? What they're saying is that love, the agape love that Christ demands from us, is a total, logical, rational commitment that you are going to take care of that person until one of you is dead. That's what love is. And that love is, in fact, rational and logical, and, in fact, mutually beneficial. But it's not emotional. The emotional, like the lusting kind of emotional love that you get between a husband and wife, um, if the two people truly care for each other, it would obviously develop in the cases of arranged marriages, or in the case of a marriage that was inspired by that, it would continue. But the problem is that, especially in modern society, a lot of us get married not because we are making a commitment for that other person, but because we lust after them. And when that happens, when the sole motivation for marriage is your sexual attractive factor for that person, guess what happens? What happens when the woman has a couple of kids and now has stretch marks? What happens when the guy drinks too many beers and gets fat? What happens when both of you get old, right? All of a sudden the lust factor deteriorates, right? Assuming that underlying love isn't there, then you just think, wow, I think I could do better somewhere else, and that's why the divorce rate is so high, because we base marriage on a feeling as opposed to a commitment. Jack Sparrow versus Captain Hook. Well, Jack Sparrow is pretty much drunk all the time, so I'd give it to and Captain Hook. I think that he gets a bad rap because he lost to a kid named Peter, but at the same time, Peter Pan was flying. That's not even fair. So I would give it to Captain Hook. Um, MCU Captain America versus very first live action Captain America. Oh, MCU Captain America easily, because MCU Captain America is probably one of the strongest and most powerful forms that Captain America has ever taken. Because even in the comics, Captain America is generally not depicted as being truly superhuman as much as just the peak of human potential. And I think the Captain America in the early movie, I think it was in the 70s or something. Um, he was just a guy. So yeah. About Jesus being the rock, it's one of the epistles. The rock was Christ. Well, it's in one of the epistles that the rock was Christ. I believe you, but I need to know more specific. And what's interesting is Jesus called Peter the rock. In fact, Peter means rock. And Arabic with a $2 super chat. Thank you so much I truly appreciate it. Says, didn't Moses tap on a rock that gave water? He did. Darren Wagner, strangely enough, not with an insult, but rather one of these versus questions. Jeffrey Hunter's Captain Pike versus Bruce Greenwood's Captain Pike. Well, that's an interesting one because, we saw a little more Bruce Greenwood's Captain Pike. And while Bruce Greenwood's Captain Pike, I think, was a kindly father figure type of captain, I think Jeffrey Hunter's Captain Pike was more of a man of action. So I think that Jeffrey Hunter wins. But I also think that Anson Mount's Captain Pike would come in and slap them both silly. Never heard of Captain Pike nor these other names. Oh, wait, Kirk's predecessor, yes. I would give the original dibs because the latter seems weak to me. Yeah, I think Bruce Greenwood's Captain Pike was definitely more pacifistic than, and that's, it's kind of funny because we were just talking about meekness so much, but yeah, I think he was a little too meek for the fight. So, in other words, when you think of an arranged marriage, you think of a blossoming relationship rather than a business arrangement. Well, I think in many cases, the arranged marriage was for political or business reasons. However, there were specific duties involved with it, and one of which, and one of the most important, is that husbands and wives are to love each other. And people confuse that with the idea of lusting after each other. That was not a commandment so much, but it would naturally blossom from that. And so, regardless of the motivation of the parents marrying you, it doesn't. It still means that your commitment is to your spouse, not to your parents. It's just looking for the coffee link. Oh, is it not in the description? Shoot, I need to fix this one. I apologize. The Joker versus Ghostface. That's a tough one because it depends on which Joker you're talking about. Because in some cases, Joker is really just kind of a prankster that does silly things. And in other cases, Joker is a straight up serial killer. So I guess it really just depends. I would probably, if it's the serial killer-esque Joker, I would probably give it to Joker. If it's the pranker-esque Joker, I would give it to Ghostface. Watch Fiddler on the Roof about arranged marriages. I've seen Fiddler on the Roof, but that's not the Bible. That's just a stage play. Watch Mock Time with Spock and T'Pring. Well, talking about arranged marriage. See, that's not the same as a well. I guess you could argue it's an arranged marriage, but it's also the it's a work of fiction, and T'Pring was seeing the pool boy on the side. You expect an insult from me this morning? Okay, I'll bet you eat mashed potatoes with your hands. That's all I've got. Sorry. Wow, Darren, you must be having a bad day. That's the best you can do. I mean, I do eat mashed potatoes with my hands occasionally, but not very often. And Stanley says the link is in the description. Okay, and then he puts it in the chat. Thank you, Stan. I appreciate it. I don't know. The Bible talks about arranged marriages. I don't know. The Bible talks about arranged marriages after the patriarchs. Well, yeah, in fact, some of the patriarchs had arranged marriages. And while it's not explicitly stated, chances are the marriage between Joseph and Mary was probably an arranged marriage. So, it just, as far as the tradition of arranged marriages in the ancient world was, I mean, it was all over. It was fairly rare that young couples would decide on their own to marry. If they did, it's funny because there's a tradition that unfortunately it's kind of dying out in the West, But there was a tradition that was alive and well when I was a kid that if you were going to marry someone, you would ask permission from the father of the bride, if you're the husband to be, you would ask permission from the father of the bride uh, to take her hand in marriage, and the father of the bride would have the right to say yes or no, right? Um, and that tradition has kind of gone by the wayside for the most part. Now people just kind of do what they want to do. But there's a reason for that, and the idea was that as the parent, you would be older and wiser, and the idea is that you would want to make sure that whoever this potential son-in-law is, that he basically is capable of supporting and taking care of your daughter. And that's one of the reasons that if you look, like Joseph and Mary was a fairly typical couple back then, in that Joseph was likely between the ages of 30 and 40, and Mary was probably around 13 to 15, right? And I know that a lot of people think that that's disgusting today because people just get married because they fall in love and ooh, we have lots of stuff in common, blah, blah, blah. But back then, the idea was that the man would build his house, if you will. And so, in the case of Joseph, would be to learn a trade, carpentry, which really was more like a construction worker, if you will, because they didn't have a whole lot of trees, but we usually translate it to carpenter. And and so he built up his house to show Mary's parents that he was capable of taking care of her, and then he would go and get permission from Mary's father to marry her, assuming that her parents didn't make an arrangement with his parents. Um, and usually, like as far as parents making the arrangements in advance, was more or less for people who were landowners or had a little more influential. Mary and Joseph were clearly poor, um, and so there's and one of the ways that you can see that is that when Mary did her cleansing ritual after giving birth to Jesus, um, the 40 days that goes by, and then she does the cleansing ritual at the temple. She sacrificed two birds, and when we looked at the laws about these sacrifices in Leviticus, if you're doing a two-bird sacrifice after childbirth, it means you're poor. He eats them with no hands, indeed. The only problem with eating potatoes with no hands is, the hair falls down and it looks gets really messy. The Pharisees were permitted to marry and procreate, right? As far as I know, they were. It really wasn't until the Catholic Church that um, those in the clergy were forbidden from marrying. Paul, interestingly enough, talks about it, and this is one of the reasons I really don't like that Catholic dogma about priests and marriage, because and when Paul writes about it, he says that it is best to not marry because if you're not married, you don't have the distraction of a spouse. Because if you do have a spouse, then your number one priority on earth is to take care of your spouse. Right? That's it. That's number one thing. And so wives need to take care of their husbands, husbands need to take care of their wives. That's absolutely their first priority. Their second priority then becomes God. And now, in the modern day, especially in the evangelical church, we kind of flip that upside down and we say, well, God is my number one, my wife is my number two. But in taking care of your wife, you are honoring God. And so I think that there's a little confusion there as far as if you look at what Scripture says versus what people are, some of the things we say in church, they're a little bit off. But the truth is, your spouse comes first, and so that becomes a distraction if you want to be wholeheartedly in the ministry. And we even see instances of that because there are times if God has a specific calling, that's kind of the exception here, then that becomes your top priority. And if you look at cases like Moses, when we looked into Exodus, Moses' wife and children were somewhat neglected. Why? Because Moses had the biggest calling of any man in history. as far as outside of Christ himself, as far as he had to literally take care of the entire nation. And so, yes, his wife and children fell by the wayside during all that. However, his wife understood. And hopefully, if a man has given himself over to the ministry in some way, then hopefully his wife would understand that and ultimately should, assuming that she is a believer as well. But as far as the Pharisees, I have not seen anything that forbids them from procreating. And in fact, it would be rather because here's the problem when we think about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are all Levites. They're part of the. Keep in mind when if you've been with us on the daily live streams, which I know you have, Stan, the tribe of Levite, which included Aaron, Moses's brother, um, Aaron became the first high priest, and his sons were the priests below him, and then and that priestly line continued all the way up to 70 A.D. when the temple was destroyed. So the Pharisees that confronted Jesus, both good and bad, whether you're looking at the evil ones that basically conspired to kill Jesus, or the good ones like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, that were with Jesus, these guys are all directly descended from Aaron. So, how could they be directly descended from Aaron if Pharisees were not allowed to marry and procreate? Right? So, that's a big problem from a Catholic perspective, in that the priestly lineage, and the Catholics use the term priest for their clergy, it should be a hereditary thing, but I guess it's not. Stanley in the chat versus the actual Stanley if he's still alive in his prime. Well, that's not fair saying in his prime, because I don't know, Stan Lee in the chat. If it was Stan Lee, just like how he was in recent years, I would give it to Stan Lee in the chat for sure. But I don't know Stan Lee in the chat, his physical condition, so I can't fairly say. How wide did Catholics decide that priests should be celibate? I'm not a Catholic, so I honestly I probably should know this, but I don't. It's one of their policies that I strongly disagree with, but I don't know when it originated. Just like their whole thing with praying to the various icons of the saints, I strongly disagree with that as well. But I don't know if there's a specific writing or whatever that started this. ABJ's point about the fiddler on the roof comment earlier point is Fiddler explains the tradition of how it worked out versus modern marriage. We didn't get to understand that contrast from the study of the Bible. Yeah, but Fiddler is definitely a liberal Jewish theology. And don't get me wrong, I think Fiddler is a good play, but keep in mind that at the end of Fiddler, the parents decide that, oh, I guess getting married just for love is a good thing. Except that what they really mean, and this is where we get confused about our terminology, they're talking about lust. They're not talking about agape love. They're not talking about the commitment that is marriage. They're talking about getting married because they have feelings for each other. Many of the apostles were married with kids. That is true. Well, it just made sense. Gave the best chance of successfully raising children, a mature, established man, and a young, fertile girl. Yes, absolutely. It was logical and practical, but it's just that in our modern society, because nowadays we tend to think that couples should be around the same age, and more typically, like the man, it's kind of funny because it's kind of held over. The man is more typically a couple of years older. But if a man was 20, 30, 40 years older than the wife, then people would look at that like, oh, that's weird. Or, yeah, we know she's just a gold digger kind of thing. That's generally how we see that kind of thing. Like, you guys may remember Anna Nicole Smith, when she was at her Anna Nicole Smithiest, married a very elderly man who also happened to be very wealthy. And a lot of people said that Anna was just doing it for his wealth when she insisted that no, she married him because they loved each other. But which the funny thing is, that was more of a normal marriage from 2,000 years ago, except that both, Anna was a little too old. Mo from the Three Sturges versus Krusty the Clown. Oh, Krusty wins that hands down. No science to help older women conceive. Well, they're working on it, but I don't. It's funny because nowadays, it's more common for women in their 30s and 40s to have children, and it's still riskier than having a child when you're in your late teens to 20s. But it's safer than it was 2,000 years ago. I'm, personally, I think like I met this one woman driving the Uber, and she was my age, and she had like a 8-year-old kid, and I was sitting there thinking, man, you know, you could be dead by the time your kid graduates high school. That's a little old. And it's also, I mean, like we don't know because it's not documented, but there's a good chance that Joseph had died by the time that Jesus started his ministry, because keep in mind that we see Joseph in the beginning where he was probably, like I said, between 30 and 40 years old. And then we fast forward 30 years to Jesus doing his ministry, and Joseph is never mentioned, but Mary is around. And so if Joseph was 40, well, add 30 years, that's 70. There's a good chance he passed away of old age by that point. So I think that it's not unreasonable to assume that Joseph was, probably closer to 40 than 30. Pharisees were virtually obligated to marry because in order to become a teacher. Paul was an unusual case, and the context of Paul's better not to marry is persecution against the church by Rome. I'd have to look at what you're talking about specifically there, but I remember. Let me see if I can find where I'm talking about. Uh, so, oh, yeah, that is in. Yeah, First Corinthians. And so let's go there. All right. So First Corinthians chapter 7 is where Paul really gets into the meat of this. So we'll switch over to there. And it says, now for the matters you wrote about, is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his maternal duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. So he says, number one, it's good to not have sex, but sexual immorality is going on all over the place. So a man should only have sex with his wife should only have sex with her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it over to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. So this is, like I said, Paul gets into it here. So you should not think of, this body is me and I want my pleasure kind of thing. It's this body is hers, and she should be thinking her body is his. And that way you are giving yourself to the other person as opposed to taking from the other person. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual, notice he says, perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So if you're going to abstain from sex because you want to spend more time in prayer, basically like a sexual fast, if you will, you then need to make sure to come back together so that you're not tempted by the pleasures of the world. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, and another has that. So again, he's saying it's better to be like me. In this case, he's talking about the fact that he's celibate, but he knows that that's a gift that he has, because some of us, and that's where, like, today, where we have 750 genders and sexual identities and stuff, there are people that call themselves asexual. And if Paul were running around today and not speaking in a religious context, that would probably be him. He would be a person who does not feel the temptation to want to go have sex with people. There are people like that. It's a rare thing, but there are people like that. And he's saying that if you have this particular gift, awesome, be like me. If you don't have this gift, then you get married and you stay faithful to your spouse. So now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So again, so he's saying, so if you're single or a widow, then the ideal situation is to stay single, so that you can focus on doing the Lord's work. But if you're burning with passion, another nice way to say, every time you see someone, you're like getting a little lusty there, right? So then it is better to marry than to fall into temptation. But to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. So this is again kind of reiterating when Christ was talking about marriage, is supposed to be sacred. It is supposed to be a lifelong commitment. And so even if you're separated, he's basically saying your only option is to get back together with your husband, for a wife, or for a husband to get back together with his wife. And this is the biblical view on marriage, is that there is virtually no reason to get divorced. Christ makes the exception of basically infidelity. And you could make a case for things like abuse or neglect. But in the real world, if the sad thing is that if people actually followed what the Bible says about marriage, divorce rate would be very, very low. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. And this is kind of interesting. This is one of the very few times that you see Paul is saying, this is not necessarily a commandment from God. This is me as a wise person telling you this. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. So that's actually kind of it. So if you are married to a non-believer and they are willing to stick with you, then you should not divorce them just because they're not a believer. And so for those people that say, oh, well, if I'm married to a Muslim or if I'm married to an atheist, that's grounds for divorce, try again, because according to Paul, that is not the case. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through the believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So he's basically suggesting that, if you are a Christian believer and you're married to an unbeliever, that your belief can help cover them. And that seems a little weird, but this is, and this is Paul talking. But, and notice he says this is not a commandment from the Lord. This is what he thinks as a wise person. And he does give himself some credit for that. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. If the brother or sister is not bound, the brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So again, if your spouse is a non-believer and they leave you because you're a believer, so be it. then that you are not considered, like you didn't do anything wrong, but you should not instigate the divorce. And we'll go back. I don't know how much time we have left. Okay. And Stan, so we got about 25 minutes. Stan says, even though women are technically capable of having kids until menopause, the probability starts dropping way off because they completely run out of eggs. Well, and menopause isn't even that they like run out of eggs. It's not like there's, exactly the number of eggs as for the number of cycles women have before menopause. Women have, many, many hundreds or even thousands more eggs than is needed. But those eggs have an expiration date apparently. But the systems themselves, the female reproductive system, stops working at menopause. Pharisee marriage, what I learned, I don't claim authority. I'm not saying you did. Catholic priests can become one if they're already married, only under very specific circumstances. You cannot, for example, if you are a believing Catholic, you cannot go to seminary and become a priest if you are married, my understanding is. However, if you are an Orthodox priest and you convert to Catholicism and you are married, then that is acceptable. I believe that's how you get around it if you really want to. But I think but you see, the funny thing is, if there are exceptions to the oath of celibacy, then I guess the oath of celibacy really isn't that important, and so they should drop it. Celibate priesthood is post schism, so 1100 or later. You're probably right, because the Orthodox don't all believe in celibacy, so yeah, you're probably right. What's the proper response to a Catholic who says he's praying for you? Do you tell him not to pray for you, or maybe just reply, you're praying for them? If a Catholic tells me that they're praying for me, I would say thank you. I mean, it's. I think that we confuse, like, while I strongly disagree with many Catholic doctrines, like the oath of celibacy is a minor issue to me. It's to me, it's wrong to make your priests go through that. But and honestly, that's why I didn't. I briefly attended a Catholic church, and that's why I stopped, because I was seriously thinking about becoming a priest until I heard about that, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But the so the oath of celibacy is kind of a minor thing. I'm not a fan of the prayer to the saints. And I get that they say you're praying through the saints, or really what you're doing is you're asking the saints to pray to God for you. But there's no biblical basis for this, and it does seem, very much like you're worshiping statues of the saints. If you go to these Catholic churches, they have these beautiful statues that are very reminiscent of the Roman gods and goddesses, except that they're, Catholic saints. And that seems kind of weird to me. And, I can't get past that one. I strongly disagree. So there's the high church, low church thing. A lot of people don't understand what high church and low church mean. People tend to think high church means big cathedrals and reverent music and all that, and that's not what high church, low church is. Now, granted, in Catholic Church, you do have the big cathedrals and the organ music and all that, but that's not. That's reverence, but it's not necessarily what it means to be a high church. A high church is a church that gives high authority to the church. A low church is a church that gives high authority to the Bible and less authority to the church, and in some cases, almost no authority to the church for the very, very low churches. And so, for example, the lowest of the low or I'm sorry, I should say the highest of the high churches is not the big Catholic cathedrals and all that. It would be the far left progressive churches, who basically say that the Bible has almost no authority whatsoever. And so they put the church way above scripture because, oh yeah, the Bible says this, but it doesn't really mean that, because you do what you think feels good, and just do what you want. That's throwing you're throwing out the Bible in favor of your doctrines. So you got to be careful about that. Thank them for their prayers. You absolutely do. So what's the headless horseman versus Ghost Rider? Well, that's an interesting one, only in one respect. All right, that's it. I'm taking this off you because you just keep pulling your legs out of the sleeves. So we're just gonna. There we go. There. Better. All right. So Headless Horseman versus Ghost Rider, because you would think, because Ghost Rider can't use his penance stare on the Headless Horseman because the Headless Horseman has no eyes for him to stare into, right? But and people will argue whether or not you can actually use the penance stare on someone who has no eyes. But the even if the Headless Horseman is immune to the penance stare, I think that Ghost Rider's got a few more tricks up his sleeve than the Headless Horseman does. So I would have to give that one to Ghost Rider. Yeah, Ghost Rider could say, "Look into my eyes," but Horseman can't look. Isn't that encouraging them to pray to Mary and other intermediaries and promote sin from the Protestant perspective? Well, if they say I'm praying, like if they say I'm praying for you, I would say thank you. If they would say something like I'm going to pray to Mary for you, or I'm going to pray to Saint Paul for you, or something, I would say I would rather that you just pray for me. You know, but if they just say I'm going to pray for you, then I just say thank you, because I'm not going to make that assumption. Daniel says Michael Bolton pre versus after haircut. Oh, pre haircut, Michael Bolton wins all the way. Solid Tracker, Columbo versus Sherlock Holmes in a battle of detective skills, of course. Um, well, it's kind of funny because a lot of people would say, well, Sherlock Holmes, of course, because he is the world's greatest detective and all that. But the thing about Columbo, if you've never watched Columbo, it's kind of hilarious. Columbo solves every case in like 10 seconds, and then he just spends the rest of the episode trying to find the proof he needs. And so I think I would have to give it to Columbo, because Sherlock Holmes usually takes a while to actually solve his cases, where Columbo solves his cases and then looks for evidence. Are they suggesting that children could suffer if their parents become unfaithful? I think that yes, because look, it's unbiblical to say that children are directly punished. I know that people argue about some of the different lines in Scripture, but I think my understanding is children are not directly punished for the sins of their parents. However, there are consequences of the sins of the parents, and if your parents walk away from God, then there's a higher degree of probability that the kids will as well. And so I think that it is, it's better for the kids to have believing parents. Am I on the line if my dad runs around? Well, you're not on, like right now, you're an adult. So, no, if your dad runs around, that doesn't give you excuses to screw around. But it just means that your dad is committing a kind of a double duty sin, in that, like Jesus even says, woe to those that lead the children astray, right? That's in Jesus's eyes, it seems that that's like one of the worst things you can do, is to lead someone else away from God. And so, or to mislead them by teaching them falsehoods. That's one of the reasons that if you are out there doing like what I'm doing right now or whatever, you better make sure that, if you're wrong, that you're honestly wrong, as opposed to you're telling people things you know are not true. Not all Catholics pray to saints. I was raised Catholic, and we were just told we were told to just pray to Jesus. The saints were more like examples. That's interesting, Eric. But let me ask you, and serious question then. So you never said the Hail Mary? I mean, I mean, Our Father, sure, we all do that, but you've never said the Hail Mary prayer. You've never prayed the Rosary at all, because that seems very not Catholic to me. I mean, it could be like, but the funny thing about the Catholics is that the Catholics have spawned also. A lot of people just think the Catholics are this one super church. But in actuality, there are a lot of variances within Catholicism. In fact, one thing I learned doing some research on it is that, look, for example, when you look at some of the craziness in South America with like Day of the Dead and all that, that's all spawned from Catholic churches that, and because what the Catholic Church did, and they did this repeatedly through the ages, that they would take various pagan things that locals were doing and adapt them into their religion so that they could turn it into a way of worshiping Christ. That's why, we got Christmas trees and, and December 25th is Christmas Day and all that. However, while I don't particularly have a problem with Christmas, then you look at things like the Day of the Dead down in South America. That seems like you're pushing it a bit. And even like the practice of voodoo is an offshoot of the Catholic Church. And so I think that the fact that it can go that far astray means that you need to be very careful. ABJ says, hot takes. Picard season 2 is better than season 3. Season 3 is mostly a reunion after the first few episodes rather than a proper show. Season 3, in my opinion, was the worst season of Picard. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but season 3, the only reason people like it is because it was floor to ceiling full of member berries that people liked. And so, oh, look, hey, there's the prop from that episode. Oh, look, there's the ship from that episode. Oh, look, there's the character from that episode. Oh, look. And, but the truth is, the story was pretty lame. And the fact that in the climax, the Enterprise flew into the Death Star like the Millennium Falcon in Return of the Jedi was just insulting. No, the Hail Mary wasn't part of Mass. I guess our Catholic Church was a liberal one. Or actually, I would say more conservative if they were leaving out stuff that the Catholic Church has added. Because keep in mind, from a theological standpoint, conservative versus liberal. Well, I mean, you could say you're liberal in that you're not following the Catholic traditions, but you're following traditions that predate the Catholic Church. So in that sense, you're more conservative. And so it's funny because you look at we think of conservative and liberal from a political spectrum, which it's funny because many liberal Christians are liberal politically as well, but they don't mean the same thing. A liberal theology versus conservative theology is basically how much do you hold to the traditions of the church you attend. Now, it tends to be, it's not 100% true, but it tends to be that high churches tend to be more conservative because they put so much authority into the church, where low churches tend to be more liberal because, uh, they tend to put less authority to the church. You would think that that would make perfect sense, except that some of the most low churches out there, outside of the far left progressive churches, are things like non-denominational churches that tend to be conservative evangelical churches, but they just reject all church tradition. And so that makes them very low church. They put very little authority into the church itself. Most Protestants believe and in fact, it's a big part of Protestantism, is sola scriptura, the idea that the highest authority is, and by the way, sola scriptura, people get confused on that. They think it means that Scripture is the only authority. That's not what it means. What it means is that Scripture is the only infallible authority. But even then, people get confused because when you start talking about biblical infallibility, well, then you start pointing out little things like trivia points, like, hey, how come it says, that this army was 100,000 in this passage, but 200,000 in this? Aha, it's not infallible, and therefore all of your theology is wrong. Except that when we talk about infallibility, we're not talking about English translations of manuscripts. We're talking about the actual original documents were completely infallible. Unfortunately, we don't have the original documents, but through careful historic research, we can pretty closely ascertain what they were. And so, do we have it at 100%? No. However, we have it at I would say, a solid 99.5%. Because basically the few passages that are in question, if, open up your Bible and go to the end of the Gospel of Mark, I think it is, and you'll see the footnotes. It'll say, hey, these passages weren't in the earliest manuscripts. So when there is a serious discrepancy, it's pointed out usually in your Bible. Most people just don't realize it. Robert says, I watched Tapestry last night on Pro TV. It's a good episode, but is overrated. A young Picard was much like Kirk. I thought Tapestry was all right. That's the one where Picard gets stabbed in the heart, right? And Q takes him back and gives him a second chance and all that. I thought it was a good episode. I don't know that I would say Picard was much like Kirk, because Kirk was brash but not foolish. And young Picard was brash and foolish. So, but I did think it was a good episode. But strange, in the TNG era, Picard didn't get a normal heart when one was available unless they did away with organ donorship by then. Well, you would think that if synthetic organs were so easy to manufacture, then why would you bother with organ donation? Because think about it. If you have somebody wants to donate their heart, and so then when they die, you got to get the heart, put it on ice, and transport it to wherever the recipient's going to be in a very short period of time. That's a very short window you have to actually do the surgery. All that being said, it seems like, I mean, because here's part of the problem that you run into with Star Trek technology. If, from what we've seen, particularly in the TNG era, for not the TOS era as much, but in the TNG era, it's painfully clear that all you need is a few hundred, or even, well, actually all you really need is, if you, for example, are, you're stabbed in the heart, that you go to the transporter and pull up your transporter pattern and then just materialize your heart, and then you have a perfectly compatible donor heart, because it was just replicated more or less from your own DNA. And how do I know this would work? Well, because we've seen in the show that transporters have duplicated whole people. So it's not like they're not doing that. Hey, babe, someone wants to see you. um, so I think that it's difficult to, I mean, because that's one of the big problems in the TNG era, is the technology becomes just too magical at that point. I think that's why I like the TOS era. In aside from better writing, is the fact that the technology is limited enough to where drama can happen. Because the problem with TNG is every time there's a drama that revolves around a medical condition, well, they cured death with the transporters. So, you know, there's really nothing, there's no medical emergency that should be able to trump the fact that transporters can cure everything. Um, and yeah, but in the original series, transporters weren't duplication machines, as we see in episodes like The Enemy Within. If two of you materialize, you're split in half, and that's why the two Kirks were dying without each other. Whereas in TNG, you have, William and Thomas Riker are just transporter copies of each other. And so you can literally make another sentient living human being by, using the same pattern twice. And so, and if that's the case, Well, why don't we have unlimited armies of, like we worry about the Jem'Hadar being able to populate quickly because they're grown in test tubes. But hey, we can just beam, a million red shirts anywhere we want because all we need is one red shirt that we can copy a million times over. Gotta go to church. See you later. All right, Lee, take it easy. Aravic says they used transporters in the animated series to de-age the crew. They did. And so, which is funny because when they did it to Pulaski in season 2 of TNG, everybody's like, oh, what a brilliant idea. Except that, yeah, they did that in the 70s. So, yeah. But yeah, starting with that, I mean, they basically, they make the transporters too powerful, and that they basically make it so that the transporters, can absolutely, destroy you and bring you back to life. So yeah. And Mike Richards, the best thing to come out of Columbus, Ohio, is here. Good to see you, buddy. Hope you are doing well. And you're here with 5 minutes and 1 second to spare. So yeah. Anybody else before we wrap things up? Waiting. Waiting. Bueller. Oh, well, for those of you that stuck with me this far, I have some really, really exciting news. So hold on to your hats, everybody. You're going to be shocked by this. You really will. At least I was. But so and stay up this week. Let me check my schedule because I don't want to lie to you. Bear with me. What is today? Today is the 9th. So this week, yeah, there will not be a study on Monday, but there will on Tuesday. But so let me tell you guys about this real quick. I really wish movie night with Matthew would come back, but yeah, Matthew has expressed no interest in doing it. So unless he reaches out to me and says, "Hey, let's do it again," then Um, by the way, did you know your buddy Criticless has partnered with Nerdrotic and Geeks and Gamers? Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, look, Criticless has tried to grow as a product, and Nerdrotic and Geeks and Gamers are big channels, so it makes sense. And you know what? I don't think I think Criticless should have a diverse set of opinions, so I don't have a problem with that. But anyway, the so the what was I going to say? So the big news. You guys are distracting me. So is some of you? Well, okay. So my daughter has been pestering me for some time to reach out to a state organization. It's actually run by the state called Voc Rehab. And because Voc Rehab is basically something that helps disabled people like me try to get back to work. Now, the problem that I had with this idea is that, well, if you look at what they do, typically what you would find is that they would find people who were like, say, severely developmentally delayed or something like that, and they would get them jobs as Walmart greeters or getting shopping carts at the grocery store. So simple menial tasks that you could get somebody to do with relatively unskilled. And so I was very pessimistic about talking to these people because I was like, yeah, that's not. First of all, I'm not even physically capable of gathering shopping carts in a parking lot, and being a Walmart greeter, I probably make more as an Uber driver. So and I have the flexibility as an Uber driver to work whenever I can, not when by a schedule. So I was extremely pessimistic going in, but a few weeks ago, I reached out to them and requested an appointment. They scheduled a time for me to talk to them, which was earlier this week. So we had a. I love that they call it like a teleconference meeting or something. It's a phone call, whatever. But so I had the teleconference meeting with the representative from Vogue, and very nice lady. And she basically told me. She asked me to tell her a little bit about my story, my disability, and all that stuff. What I did before, why I couldn't continue doing that, blah blah blah. And so I told her all that. And then she said, okay, so if you could do anything right now, what would you want to do? And so I have to admit, I was a little snarky here. And thank you, Kyle Cullen, with a $2 super chat just because. Thank you. Live long and prosper, Kyle. Um, so, you know, uh, so I was, like I said, I was being a little snarky, but, that's me. And so I thought about it, and I thought about, well, as a kid, this is 100% true. I didn't lie to her. Yes, I know. Time is up. So um, as a kid, I had always fantasized about being. Uh, I didn't know the term at the time, but basically, what would be a theoretical astrophysicist. Um, and I was inspired when I was very young by the likes of Spock and stuff, and then also looking later in life, you know, as far as things that I could do, I was like, well, hey, if Stephen Hawking could do it, I can do it because as bad as my condition may be, I'm not as bad off as Stephen Hawking. So that's what I told her. And so I'm expecting her to kind of laugh at me and try to give me something a little more reasonable to do. But instead, she's like taking notes and saying, okay, so to be an astrophysicist, you would probably need like a doctorate level education. Um, and so, and she's just kind of talking about that. So, yeah, but, it's not like I can do all that. I mean, you guys don't put people through doctorate level schooling, do you? And she goes, well, what we do is we find out what you want for your career path, and then we find out what the minimum level of education is for that career path. And so she said like they commonly like people would go into there and they want to be like a social worker or something to help out other people that were in their circumstances, and that usually requires a master's, and so they put them through to get their master's. So I have some paperwork to fill out and everything, but if all goes well, starting at the probably the spring term next year, I will be going back to school as a physics major. So that will be really really cool. So um, that way, when people argue, well, you don't know the physics of this, especially when I'm talking about theological stuff and talking about how I think quantum mechanics is a very, very fancy mathematical shell game. Now I'll be able to say, well, not now, but in about 8 to 10 years, I'll be able to say, I am a doctor and I can say this is true because, other PhDs might disagree with me, but I have the PhD now too, so shut up. So yeah. So that and yeah, actually, Stan, I'll probably change my name to Doctor Salty at that time because professor is a specific position. A doctor is the title you get for getting your doctorate degree. So, um, so if I get the PhD, I'll be Doctor Salty. If I actually became a college professor somewhere, yeah, I'd call myself Professor Salty, and I already look like a professor, so that would be cool. Um, but chances are, I would just be a doctor. Um, So yeah, that's really exciting to me and also very nerve wracking because man, I do not know jack about the core of physics is calculus. I know nothing about calculus, and so I actually started looking up a couple of things online as far as tutor programs to get me ready for calculus hopefully before I start. So I'm kind of working my way through the basics right now. So I'm like in pre-algebra right now, just kind of going through stuff, refreshing myself. Like most of that's pretty child's play easy. But when we get into like quadratic equations and stuff, I'm going to have to relearn that stuff. But yeah. Yeah, so I'm really excited about that. Uh, Robert says, "Oh, I was so sad about the explosive plant blowing up and killing everyone that worked there in Tennessee. Did y'all feel that when you, where you live at? They said it was like 20 miles away. I did not. I did see the day it happened. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I did see like a big plume of smoke from it. But I did not actually hear it or feel it or anything like that. Yes, and there you go. It's Doctor Salty. That's not yet, but I will be. Right now, I will be undergrad student Salty. So you will get some new ears. Yes. Congratulations. Thank you. Back to school. Maybe join the diving team. Yeah, I'm not joining the dive, but I might join the debate team if I can. Is that with imaginary numbers? Yeah, imaginary numbers are a part of it, and and this is where I think that people. That one of the reasons that I think some physicists I think lose touch with reality sometimes is that we have mathematics that are logically consistent that do not correlate to the real world, and imaginary numbers is one of those things. So for example, if x represents the number of tomatoes you have, and you have 1x or 2x, then 2x would be twice as many tomatoes as 1x, right? But if you have I, that's for the imaginary numbers. If you have ix, there's nothing in the real world that correlates to that. You can't have an imaginary number of tomatoes. And further, like things that make sense mathematically and don't correlate to the real world is actually at the very core of people like Krauss and others' ideas of how the universe could come from nothing. And the idea being that, okay, if nothing equals zero matter and energy, then you could get all the matter and energy in the universe you have as long as you take an equal number of positive and negative at the same time, because zero can mathematically can is the same as 1 plus negative 1, or 10 plus negative 10, or 100 billion plus negative 100 billion. So as long as the universe and the way they come up with this as far as energy and negative energy is that they say that gravity is a negative energy. And so if gravity is negative energy, then the gravity offsets all the mass, and therefore, you have 10 to the whatever power of mass and 10 to whatever power of gravity, and together they equal zero. And therefore, the universe can literally equals nothing and all that. That's silly, okay? I'm sorry. I can't just reach into thin air and get $100 and a negative $100 at the same time, right? So it doesn't work that way. But mathematically, it makes sense. So I think mathematics is a great way to try and express the logical consistency of something you're talking about with reality, but mathematics do not mean reality. That's my opinion on it. And I know that's a philosophical stance, but as I work towards my doctorate, hopefully I'll get a better understanding so that I can either strengthen my argument against it or have my mind changed. And use those weird extra buttons on the top of the calculator. Yes. Never sure why calculators had all those extra buttons. Well, the sad thing now is that when I was scanning for apps that could help me refresh my algebraic knowledge and stuff, and hopefully work towards calculus, I saw this one app and it was so terrible. It was specifically for college students. And you basically, it connects to your camera, you scan an algebraic equation, and then it just does it for you. That's just messed up. Eric says, good luck with studies. Thank you, my friend. When you just need a plus, minus, multiply, and divide. Yeah. I thought about going back to school for astronomy. Well, actually, that's what I'll probably be. So the funny thing is, there's several areas of astrophysics, right? So there's plain old astrophysics, and then there's three main categories that you can major in. There's astrophysics, astronomy, and cosmology. Now, if I had my druthers, which is an old-fashioned saying of just if I had it my way, I would take cosmology. That's the study of the universe itself. So basically, the Big Bang and the entirety of the universe, how space time works, the big picture, right? So that's what I would want to take, but I can't. And it's not that I can't because I'm not capable of doing it. It's I can't because in the state of Tennessee, there is no accredited university, private or public, that offers any degree, not bachelor's, not postgraduate, for cosmology. So unfortunately, that's off the table. And the VOC program works specifically within the state of Tennessee. So I can't go to a school in Kentucky or whatever and take it there. I have to take it in a Tennessee school. So that limits me to the other two categories, which are astrophysics and astronomy. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people say astronomy is a branch of astrophysics. Other people say that astrophysics is a branch of astronomy. I tend to think of it as the latter because when you look at it, so astronomy is the study, generally observationally, of everything that is not on Earth, right? So planets, stars, nebula, dark matter, dark energy, everything, right? And that does include the big picture cosmology stuff like the Big Bang and stuff like that. But it's just that cosmology is more of a specialized thing where you're only talking about the big stuff. Astronomy has everything. So, astrophysics specifically is applied physics to all those things, right? So astrophysics is taking what the data collected in astronomy and then applying, the idea of physics to come up with, ideas and predictive models of what would or could happen. Um, so, so as far as looking at universities, I would probably go with astrophysics as my first choice. However, locally, so you have to look at each level. So I have to start with a bachelor's degree. And as far as getting a bachelor's degree, the school here in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that's a very good school called MTSU, offers a bachelor's in astronomy. It says it's a bachelor in astrophysics with a concentration on astronomy. And so that is a course that's already available and it's local. MTSU is 20 minutes from my house, so easy peasy. However, there are there's uh, three other schools in the state of Tennessee that also have astrophysics departments. Now, two of those three only offer doctorate level courses, so I would still have to go to. And besides that, it'd make more sense to go to MTSU for the bachelor's because it's local and easier on the budget. So the three other schools, only one of them is really well, two of them really are in proximity close enough to make reasonable. There's Vanderbilt University, which is a private school, and Vanderbilt does offer a doctorate in astronomy. And not only that, Vanderbilt is actually rated as one of the top 0.5% schools in the country for astrophysics. So it would be a great school to go to, but a very hard school to get into. And then the other two are the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which has I can't remember if it might be astrophysics and astronomy or it's one or the other. And then the other one is Tennessee Tech, which I believe is in Cooksville. Knoxville is about 2.5 hours away, so that would be a little bit of a challenge. I would have to, if I ended up going to Knoxville for my postgraduate studies, I would either have to get an apartment in Knoxville and travel back and forth, which would be expensive, or we'd have to just move to Knoxville, which ain't going to happen. So that one would be difficult. At least Vanderbilt University is in Nashville, and so while I don't like driving to Nashville, at least it's doable. The one in Cookville is also only about an hour away, so that would be doable as well. So it would be a long commute, but it would be a reasonable one. So I don't know where I'm going to go yet for postgraduate, but for my undergrad, I'm probably going to go to MTSU or Tennessee Tech. I think they offer an undergrad degree as well, because uh, depending on what the course, I'm going to be looking over the course and courses that they offer and all that. Whichever one offers more cosmology courses, I'll probably go with that. So, anyway, that's about it. So I know there's a few more comments, so I'll try to get through them real quick, but then I got to go. Mr. Know-It-All is going to dress up like a clown for Halloween. Well, so he's just going to dress up as himself, huh? Salty's brain. Brain and brain. What is brain? Then you can put NDT in his place. Okay, not sure what you mean. Discovery versus Starfleet Academy equals poop. Yeah, that's about right. Knock Tyson down a few. Oh, man, you better believe. If I was actually a PhD, I could. It's funny because I think I'm older than Tyson, but I would love to get in a room with him and just say, "Okay, Tyson, let's talk about dark matter," because yeah, that's where I'm going to hopefully get my PhD thesis on. Mr. Know-It-All's poop versus Michael's poop. Well, I've never seen Mr. Know-It-All's poop, so I can't fairly ascertain that one. Oh yeah, that show is looking worse and worse. Hopefully there'll be a nerd fights this week and they can pick apart the newest trailer. Yeah, hopefully we will. Factually, yesterday I was asking AI. Actually, yesterday I was asking AI to solve third-year university math questions, and it did those extremely well in concept, although it could never compute a sin correctly. Well, because computers don't understand the concept of sin. Captain Hook versus Long John Silver. I see what you're doing there. So you're taking the winners of the other two, and now who wins up there? I would probably give it to Captain Hook because he's got a sword and a hook. Maybe just get a dorm and live on campus. Well, that's the thing. We'll have to see because for postgrad students, I don't know that dorm living is an option, but we'll find out. Not for someone who's older, married, and has a house. Yeah, that's going to be a challenge. It's not called a bachelor degree. Well, it is called a bachelor degree. That is true. Because typically you're a bachelor when you get one. If you take on Tyson, remember to wear something on your ears. Oh, I'll be wearing a full-on Star Trek uniform if I ever go meet Tyson. That would be so fun. All right, guys. So I'm going to wrap it up there. And so thank you guys for indulging me. And who knows, in a few years, you'll have to call me doctor.